Let me ask you, Jason Kander. You are, in addition to being a former Missouri state official, a veteran of the Army. And there's been a lot of talk this week about how much President Trump is deferring to the generals, whether it comes to the Syria strike, most particularly with the bomb dropped in Afghanistan. It's not clear if President Trump knew about that ahead of time even. And when it comes to North Korea, General Secretary Mattis is the one who issued a statement yesterday. Are you concerned about that at all, or do you like the deference to the generals?
I'm deeply concerned about it because if you think back to when he was asked whether or not he approved the dropping of the MOAB in Afghanistan, his answer was something along the lines of, it started with, and then it went from, to everybody knew exactly what was going on, which was, of course, the opposite of true. I mean, he was giving that answer because he didn't want people to know exactly whether he approved it or not. And what bothers me about that is that there were really only two acceptable answers to that question. The first was, I am the commander-in-chief. It was an important decision to make a change like that, to step up to that level of using that weapon, and so I made the decision. And the second was, here's why that decision was made by a tactical commander on the ground, and then defend it. But he doesn't do either of those things, and I believe that the reason is because he wants to take credit for good things when they happen and blame generals when bad things happen, and that's no way to lead a military, certainly the most powerful military in the world.
You had a son in the Marines. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, in that case, I think General Nicholson made a battlefield call. That's part of our arsenal. There's no fundamental difference between dropping 10 bombs that together add up to the explosive force.
Though. I mean, it's a big step.
I don't know if it's that big a step. I mean, anyway, whatever. The president should take responsibility for the big strategic decisions. I don't think you want a president micromanaging the generals in certain respects. And actually, the generals who are civilians now, General Mattis, now Secretary of Defense, or General McMaster, who's not a civilian but in a civilian role as National Security Advisor, I would say have thought long and hard about civilian control of the military. They have a long record of understanding that. McMaster in Iraq, Jason knows this, was one of the key advocates of counterinsurgency, of making sure you have to win hearts and minds. You can't just bomb people into submission. That McMaster made his name at Tel Afar in 2005 by, in a way, doing the counterinsurgency before Petraeus made it famous. Mattis has written a lot about this and thought a lot about this. So I'm not worried about McMaster and Mattis.
But one of the say, yeah, it's not just about whether or not he made that decision. It's the other things that the president has done. It's pushing responsibilities down of whether or not to conduct raids in countries like Yemen, down below that level. And that coming after him saying about Ryan Owens, the Navy SEAL who was killed, that the generals lost him, rather than saying we lost him. We as a country lost him.
Right.
That is a big difference. And from a military leadership point of view, that concerns me a lot.
One of the things that's interesting is we've seen a lot of President Trump talking about how difficult issues are, and he didn't realize it. He said that about health care a few weeks ago. This week he said about North Korea to the Wall Street Journal, you're talking about thousands of years and many wars, and Korea actually used to be a part of China. And after listening for 10 minutes to Chinese President Xi, he's referring to, I realized that it's not so easy. Bakari?
Well, I mean, I think we understood that we elected a president of the United States who had this knowledge deficit when he went into the office. I mean, we all understand that. We all agree, Democrats and Republicans alike. But I think one of the biggest problems that many people, including myself, have is that when you're addressing issues like North Korea or Syria or Afghanistan, the White House seems to be ill-prepared. For a perfect example, not only was he ill-prepared for the meeting with President Xi, but you look at the fact that we don't have an ambassador to China. We don't have an ambassador to Japan. We don't have an ambassador to South Korea. We don't even have a deputy secretary of state to East Asia. And so we're doing all of these things, and the White House is fundamentally broken. We're not prepared to take on these challenges. And so whether or not it's the meeting or whether or not it's his staff or whatever, we are fundamentally unprepared on the world stage.
We should just point out that there are people acting in those roles, just not formal.
Can we at least give him credit for actually engaging with China? Especially when it comes to North Korea. I mean, I know that there are so many things that, you know, people would prefer for him to do a little bit better, but that's why he got elected. I mean, he got elected because he wasn't the regular politician. They wanted somebody
Well, I also think as a country, though, I understand not being a regular politician, but when we're expanding our military footprint, because right now we're on the verge of war in 3 different countries, which, with all due respect to President Trump or President Obama or anybody else, Democrat or Republican, that fundamentally terrifies me.
He has not fundamentally changed Obama's policies in any of those areas.
I'm not saying
there were troops in Syria when President Obama left office. We were fighting in Afghanistan.
We were fighting 500 troops.
They were fighting in Afghanistan. Maybe you're not aware of that throughout the Obama administration.
We've been there for 16 years.
North Korea, President Obama, to his credit, already had launched a cyber program to try to sabotage their nuclear program.
Are you saying that over the last 2 weeks, are you saying that we haven't reached a point where we are escalating things in Afghanistan, Syria, and North Korea?
I think the main difference is Syria, where President Trump, to his credit, came through when President Obama didn't.
Yeah.
Wow, that's
Here's what concerns me is
And incidentally, most Democrats supported the strike in Syria. So what are you talking about?
I agree with the strike, but the problem is
President
the
Obama had a
follow-up was
strategy.
Correct.
That's the difference. The difference is that President Obama had a strategy.
Which was what, to draw a red line and then not enforce it?
He had an overall strategy. The people in his administration understood commander's intent. In the military, commander's intent is when there's a decision to be made and you don't have exact guidance at that moment, you know overall what the boss wants. Nobody has that in the Trump administration. There is not commander's intent because he is doing whatever comes to his mind from the last person he talked to. So yes, he is engaged with the president of China. He had a 10-minute conversation, which has apparently shaped our policy toward North Korea. That is the problem.
or
based on his last
pictures,
conversation.
or how he goes from being a non-interventionist in Syria to having pictures shown to him that fundamentally change his foreign policy.
I just want to interrupt because President Trump just tweeted. I don't know if he's watching the show right now, but possibly. It seems like a lot of his tweets are tracking with what we're talking about. But he just tweeted, "Our military is building and is rapidly becoming stronger than ever before. Frankly, we have no choice."
Maybe he was
You know,
responding.
can I just say, I like the old adage, peace through strength. And I think that we need to do everything we can to make sure that we build up our military so that we are ready for situations
And that ain't
like
strong.
this.
What that tweet doing, that's not strong.
Well, I think that, you know, making sure that we have people that are enlisting and not just bodies, but trained bodies, so that when we have situations like this, we know that when we are sending people, even as terrifying as war is, because it is incredibly terrifying, it is a lot better if we are much more
There were
prepared
troops.
for
There
it.
were already troops in South Korea, in Afghanistan, and some in Syria. So this is not. I mean, I would say if President Trump is serious about building up a military, he should insist on the supplemental that is needed
I
in
guess
the next month.
one
I
of
mean,
the
he talks much more about increasing the defense budget than he's actually done about it.
One of the issues, I suppose, is that you're right that there were U.S. presence in all these places, but there has been an escalation in Yemen, in Syria,
Somalia.
in Africa, and then obviously the use of this new bomb in Afghanistan. And one of the things that I think is curious about it is that we don't necessarily know why. I mean, other than he wants to bomb the bleep out of ISIS, most of his talk on the campaign trail was about redirecting American attention to the United States. That's all.
I agree with that, and I think he's been mugged by reality and is stumbling his way towards a better foreign policy. We'll see how much he can sustain and how much he listens to McMaster and Mattis and people who have thought this
And
through.
I still think he needs to engage Congress, because at the end of the day,
I
we're
would
the
pray
ones that
that.
have to
I actually
make the
agree with you and
decisions.
Barbara Lee and others on this, that he does need to come back and engage Congress, because we're in a very war-weary country. As you stated earlier, we've been in Afghanistan for 16 years. I mean, I lost 3 classmates, high school classmates in war. So when we're making these acts, I mean, you served, you have a son that served, and when we're making these acts, these are not just pieces on a chessboard. These are human lives. And I don't want somebody just fundamentally watching State of the Union and tweeting about it. I want somebody who has a sound policy, because I do agree with the strikes in Syria. But
And
what's the policy?
increase national defense.